Happy Future Day, everybody. Welcome, Andreas. And we're going to be discussing some very interesting topics here today. Andreas is going to give us a talk on the aesthetics of the meta aesthetics. So without further ado, I'll hand you over to Andreas to begin the presentation. And afterwards, we'll have Q&A.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for inviting me. Hopefully this works. I had like some technical difficulty earlier, but okay, beautiful. Yes, fantastic.
Looking good.
Okay, beautiful. Okay, so the aesthetic of the meta aesthetic. So essentially, the overarching claim that I'm gonna make here is that rather than kind of like doubling down on your favorite aesthetic that exists nowadays, you should probably kind of consider the way in which your affiliation to particular aesthetics has been constructed, such that we can deconstruct it and, in a sense, like be able to troubleshoot kind of all of the problems that we're experiencing in our polarized society nowadays. So to get started, okay, the first image I'm showing you, this is the image that we use at QRI in order to symbolize what I call the Goldilocks zone of oneness, which is kind of the merging of different theories of personal identity. So this contains kind of the symbolism of this notion of we are all one consciousness. I think that's a very essential key component of kind of like any conception of reality. Also acknowledging, that we're all kind of like individual selves, and like, I mean, really our lives stories have kind of inherent value, and we should cherish our individuality as persons as well. And finally, also this idea that we're also each collections of time slices, like moments of experience. And I mean, the reality is not fundamentally that like one of those views is like more true. Rather, you should think of them as ways of seeing that are synergistic, and together they paint this picture where, okay, the thing that is really going on in reality is what I describe as consciousness versus replicators, where like consciousness is kind of like wrapped up into these patterns that self-reproduce. And one of the patterns that self-reproduce the most are those that make you believe that you're those patterns, even though in truth, you're actually consciousness. And I've been toying with kind of like reframing consciousness versus replicators, perhaps as not a battle, because that sounds very belligerent and very not the right energy. Maybe instead as kind of a trade-off between clarity and confusion. That like if you are kind of like fully wrapped up into believing you're a replicator, you're confused. You just don't know you're actually consciousness. And like actually, you want to move the future forward in a good direction, we should acquire clarity about what we are, who we are. And the second image here, this is kind of like to build up a little bit of a symbolism in your mind to absorb these ideas. This is a beach. So essentially, one thing that I really love about beaches is that they are a balance of forces. I mean, essentially, it's very difficult for kind of like a beautiful kind of sand bed to form if the forces are not just perfectly right. And really, this is the balance between wind and air currents and water currents and the appropriate geology. And you need all of that for kind of like getting the actual structure that you care about. If you have too much of either, you're not going to have a beach. So my claim here is that just as, okay, let's have a balanced view of personal identity, let's have a balanced view of aesthetics. Let's not get too caught up in one. Let's instead kind of zoom out and look at the pros and cons of each of them and kind of like navigate it from that point of view. Where there is love, there is image and fantasy and mythos, Rob Burbea. So this quote is going to make a lot more sense as I go through the presentation, but I mean, essentially something that I think is very essential for us to navigate kind of disagreements, navigate, different ego identifications with aesthetics and so on, is to understand that like deep down, they're actually motivated by love and compassion. Like deep down, when somebody is like defending, with tooth and claw, like their aesthetic, their way of seeing the world, like it can get to a point that it gets really ugly, obviously, but deep down, they're actually trying to protect something from which they are deriving a lot of love and care. So that is something to kind of be mindful, to not perceive those who are defending their aesthetic as enemies. Of course, they can be like anger crazed. That's important to realize and not sugarcoat. But deep down, they're actually trying to protect love. They're trying to protect something that, yeah, they find very valuable. Okay, so where are we? So there's this really cool article, 2018 by um, Peter from the Stoa, the founder of the Stoa, the Memetic Tribes of Culture War 2.0. Because it's, the thing that I really like about it is that, you know, he's not taking any position or anything. That's, you know, good points just for that to begin with. But he's doing kind of this diagnosis of like, why are we so crazy? Why is there like all of this memetic conflict in the world? And I mean, in some sense, it's nobody's fault. It's kind of like, okay, when you have this complex dynamic system that is society with its memetic architecture and the ego identification that fuels it, yeah, there's problems that are bound to happen. So he identifies kind of a various crises that are like, unfortunately, synergistically making the situation pretty tense. So he identifies the meaning crisis, where we have kind of weakened our collective understanding of what ought to be. Like, you know, when we had like a religion everybody believed in, thought it was plausible. It was, you know, it was easier times in a way. The reality crisis, you know, it's like a fracture or collective understanding of what is. You know, obviously we have like different epistemologies, different media that we consume, you know, all of that jazz. Yeah, in some sense, yeah, that's fractionalizing our conceptions of reality. Belonging crisis, you know, we don't have like genuine community anymore. Proximity crisis, in some sense, we're all right next to each other because we're all online. And so you actually see the people who you could, you know, blame before and, okay, throw that negative energy over there. Like now they're in your face, which is, yeah, kind of a problem. Then the sobriety, you know, crisis. We're all addicted to patterns and ego reinforcement, social media and drugs and all sorts of things, and anger, obviously. And finally, yeah, the warfare crisis, which is, yeah, essentially transformed our minds into weapons for hidden wars in plain sight. So we're in deep stuff. Unfortunately, we kind of need a high dose of something to actually, you know, shake us out of this conundrum that we find ourselves in. So, and that is, yeah, I mean, I think understanding aesthetics, rather than understanding it from a moralistic perspective, will open up and soften us to kind of like new perspectives. So let me go into this. First of all, what is an aesthetic? The word aesthetic for a lot of people sounds very superficial. We're a very no nonsense kind of like systematizer, you know, like very kind of a no nonsense like type of person. You may think like, yeah, aesthetics is just like a surface level thing. It's like, do you prefer blue or red, or do you like Blue de Chanel, or do you prefer I don't know, this niche perfume, or whatever it may be, that, you know. But look, that's aesthetics at their most surface. That's not actually what I'm going to be talking about, and I'll actually be articulating why aesthetics cut to the core of your soul. Well, maybe not the absolute core, but like it's really close, very close to the core of your soul. So aesthetics at the deep level. So one way of framing it is that aesthetics are attempts at generating a coherent gestalt. You're trying to, in a sense, fit the pieces of your life together in order to create a picture that makes sense, where the things resonate with each other and they're consonant with each other. So in that sense, aesthetics are actually, you know, as gestalt generators, coherent gestalt generators, they decide on what is true and what is beautiful. They also, you know, reduce friction for some transactions and increase friction for other transactions. I mean, think of a, yeah, like somebody who's like a punk rock with a like, you know, concert with like spikes is like, okay, like there's some ways in which that person is advertising that some transactions might be kind of rough. Like there's some things you probably shouldn't say to that person, but also it's an invitation to, you know, like be like really punk with that person. So it's making that transaction easier. So that's a function of aesthetics. It's facilitating some transactions, making other transactions harder. It is something that allows you to make quick decisions for status allocations. It's kind of like the status algorithm of a group that is very highly dependent on an aesthetic. So like in some aesthetics, for example, coming from an impoverished background or something like that is kind of like a plus. In others is like a negative. In others is neutral. Just as an example, there's so many ways in which this manifests. And ultimately, yeah, I mean, what is good and what is beautiful are to first approximation experience as the same. I mean, like when you have a finely tuned aesthetic, what is true and what is beautiful are the same thing. And you use it as a heuristic. Is this beautiful? As a stand-in for is this true? Yeah, kind of like as an aside, aesthetics are in constant evolution. And there's a reason why, which is that in a sense, aesthetics are used for kind of like signaling your own sophistication, what kind of groups you hang out in. And the problem is that as soon as one aesthetic becomes legible, you will have other groups kind of like copy it and kind of like absorb that value and signal it. And so in a sense, you have kind of like the inner group of whatever, movement or aesthetic needs to constantly reinvent itself so that you can actually signal that you're in the know rather than, last season, as it were. Now, here's kind of like a cartoon picture of like probably the seeds of the sort of aesthetic conflicts that we experience nowadays. Obviously, these are very, very different ways of, thinking, presenting yourself, feeling. And I would say like, on a very shallow reading, you may say like, well, the person on the left, yeah, they like, formal clothes. The person on the right likes, hippie clothes. What's the big deal? Well, there's actually something very deep going on here. As I say this, I realize I'm wearing kind of a hippish clothes. It was not intentional. This is just me naturally. Okay, so how aesthetics play out? So they determine what you pay attention to, how you spend your time, what do you consider to be important. Just looking at those pictures, you can guess, have an educated guess of answers to these questions for these two groups. How you think power should be used, what is considered to be a good time, what feelings you cultivated, what is it that you anneal to, and I'm gonna get back to that, and what is it that you can make fun of. In some aesthetics you're not supposed to make fun of the leader. In others is like part and parcel. It's like part of the thing that generates the bonding. It's like very different ways of self-organizing. Importantly, aesthetics, kind of like the deep versus shallow conceptions as well, shows up in this. Essentially, for a lot of people, there's this science aesthetic, which is like, well, if you're wearing a lab coat and you have a, petri dish, a microscope or something like that. But again, all of that is like surface level. Actually, the science aesthetic cuts so much deeper into like just how you organize your models of reality and how what motivates you. So I recommend these two articles. They're really great for kind of like getting a sense of deep versus shallow aesthetics and these dynamics. Now, I guess you may get the impression, especially in a very polarized world, that there's just kind of like two aesthetics. My claim is actually the two aesthetics that are kind of like very dominant nowadays are really just kind of like two poles of something that is like much more like fractal and intricate, and there's a lot of like granularity to it. And I think a better way of thinking about it is not as like two poles. It's going to be much more generative and in fact a lot more freeing if you think of aesthetics as almost kind of like Pokemons. It's like there's all of these different kind of aesthetics with their special powers, their like special properties, their types. Does the aesthetic like flow like water, or does it burn like fire? Like there's a lot of kind of like subtle things like that, and an aesthetic really is kind of like an amalgam of all of those things together. Where in fact, you have kind of this rock paper scissors situation where it is not the case that like one aesthetic like wins over all of the other ones. Partly because our mind is limited, partly just because of the structure of qualia space, essentially what patterns are salient given a particular context. So this kind of like guarantees that there's almost kind of like a constant evolution of aesthetics, and it kind of looks like Pokemon battle where dark beats ghost and water beats fire and so on, and is this web. But it's actually even more complicated because there's so many aesthetics. Like I recommend spending an afternoon even like going through list of aesthetics in aesthetics wiki. These are still kind of like surface level aesthetics. They're like visual art for the most part. There's some conceptual stuff like post rock actually is like has a deep conceptual underpinning and so on. But the thing I'm trying to emphasize is that there's tremendous diversity, and ironically, the aesthetic, the view that there's like very few aesthetics is actually coming from a particular aesthetic that is trying to make the world more simple than it is. So that's kind of like an ironic thing that people who are like really polarized, you give them whatever information and they quickly classify you as like, are you in this team or in that team? And like, okay, let's try to calm down and defabricate that and realize, no, actually it's very intricate. There's like all of these possibilities. And more so, the true landscape is this very complicated grid of like which aesthetic can synergize with each other. Also, I don't want to say like these are kind of like battles in the traditional sense. It doesn't need to get violent as such. I mean, like the thing that actually is going on is which aesthetic becomes like salient, which one is attention grabbing, and that will depend on the particular context. I mean, it's similar to the game of Magic. That yes, you have kind of like some decks are obviously better than others, and like you can really mess up in making a bad deck. But in practice, like whether you win a tournament or not is not like whether you have the best deck, is whether you have the appropriate deck given what's called the meta game, like basically the distribution of decks that are currently in vogue. And again, it's something that is constantly evolving and modifying. Um, I really like this. You know, this was a fantastic experiment by Reddit r/place, where basically every person could like choose the color of a pixel in a 1000 by 1000 grid. And what I love, I love about this is that you required cooperation. You required, coalition building if you wanted to like ever actually own any piece of this board, because it's impossible otherwise. I mean, like if you only can update one pixel every 10 minutes or whatever it was, um, people will erase it, right? So you actually need to kind of like form a community, advertise yourself, and you see all kinds of strategies, right? Like some of these actually advertise themselves explicitly. Like for example, r/the cube, the blue corner or something. So like if that is there, people can go there and like join that team and kind of like try to maintain the blue corner. And it has all of these beautiful attributes because yeah, you need to be attention grabbing. You need to have resonance with people's kind of preconceptions and ego identifications, and that's how you manage to get a patch of this plot of pixel land. And yeah, I mean, I think like aesthetics are kind of like that. I mean, essentially, the Darwinian world that we live in is a completely insane competition of patterns that are trying to advertise themselves, making copies of themselves, and essentially, yeah, like the current board of kind of the cultural landscape is kind of analogous to our place. So here's kind of like a maybe as an aside, like if you look at this picture, you may think, where does this come from? Like Burning Man or something like that? No, actually, this is from SF Airport. I took it when I came back to the Bay Area last time, which is insane, right? Like this means like, okay, the trippy, hippie aesthetic from the 60s is now just completely embedded in like these macro cultural structures. In some sense, like something in that vein did something that obviously was good at winning out in kind of the competition of culture, that now it's embedded in the SF Airport. But likewise, I think like you will constantly see things like these where like aesthetics at one level might be able to colonize aesthetics at a different level of organization, and you have kind of this back and forth in okay, at what scale is the quote unquote battle for attention and an alliance happening. Okay, so now let's get into kind of aesthetic theory. Okay, what is an aesthetic? Like, can we decompose it in an insightful, meaningful, non-trivial way? And my claim is that the work of Rob Burbea, who is this amazing meditation teacher, is very valuable here. So there's a book he wrote. It's called Seeing That Frees. One of the best meditation books that I know of. I highly recommend it. He's fantastic. And one of the concepts that he has is this idea of soul making, that essentially, even if you think that you're a hardcore Buddhist and you're all about defabricating your sense of self or your conceptions of reality and so on, deep down you're actually still kind of like following an aesthetic, which might be kind of the aesthetic of defabrication. And in that sense, you're kind of not fully free from kind of like the shackles of your mind, because you're still kind of doing the beating of a particular aesthetic. So then the way in which he breaks down like how we construct kind of like our conception of the world and what is good and what is bad is essentially this kind of like pyramid of these like three components, which I'll go into in more detail, which are Eros, Psyche, and Logos. As an aside as well, like I highly recommend checking out his website or the website of his teachings. They have this soul-making retreat. What I love about it, I mean, I haven't gone to it. I'm sure it's fantastic. Actually, I have heard the recorded series of Soulmaking, and it's amazing. But you can see like there's a very, very strict, criteria for joining. A lot of like retreat centers are kind of like, yeah, even if you're a total novice, like we're desperate for people to want to participate or so on, fund the organization, whatever it may be. Well, soul making is like, no, it's actually very elitist. It's like, no, you need at least, 4-week retreat, like a 4-week retreat, familiarity with energy body practice, like self-knowledge, an open mind. You need and fulfill this application. And I actually like this. I mean, like there are some kind of levels of consciousness, of understanding, of sophisticated conceptual structures that I do think like they work a lot better if you actually select the people who are ready for them. And in that sense, yeah, I mean, soul making might be kind of like an advanced meditation practice, and I would not, jump to it right away because it's kind of risky. I would actually, yeah, encourage people to do kind of like standard, basic, loving kindness practice, mindfulness, equanimity before they get into soul making. So that's just kind of, yeah, a warning or as an aside. But yeah, I mean, essentially, um, something that kind of like comes up in soul making is this idea that this quote from James Hillman, perhaps our age has gone to analysis not to be loved or get cured or even to know thyself. Perhaps we go to be given a case history, to be told into soul story and given a plot to live by. So that is soul making. We're trying to create a plot for us to embody, and that process is the process of soul making. Another quote is to be in mythos is to be inescapably linked to divine powers and archetypes, and to moreover be in mimesis with them. So that's kind of the reward of like embodying an aesthetic, that you feel connected to divine energies. And it's crazy because this is going to happen whether the aesthetic is like, harmful or not. I mean, like if you're like really into kind of like, hyper violence and like war and so on, you could actually feel connected to divine forces, like the god of war or whatever it may be. So this is not, doesn't necessarily abide by kind of like a standard code of ethics. It actually goes far beyond it. So let's get into it. Eros is essentially the set of inner imagery that kind of gives you a thirst for life, that gives you a desire to wake up in the morning and live your life, and essentially the things that you want to get into and vivify and energize and make real. And we all have that, and people have like very different set of Eros imagery. And for the most part, if you're in a subculture with a particular aesthetic, the Eros imagery will be shared, and that's going to be very essential. I mean, speaking, I guess, as a transhumanist, obviously, just as an example, right? Like Eros imagery in transhumanism, especially of kind of the David Pierce branch, would be something like, super happiness, super longevity, super intelligence. Like, yeah, that's kind of like archetypical images that personally are like super motivating and give me thirst for life. But it's going to be something else for other people. For other people, it might be like honor and duty, or it might be like community. It might be, piety or stoicism. There's many different kinds of Eros imagery. And essentially, they are like the thinking, feeling, and seeing that capture our attention and grows into a fantasy and fascination. And I mean, this is also something we have to kind of admit. It's difficult to admit for a lot of us, obviously. That like, yeah, we think, we follow our motivational architecture is like hyper rational. It's kind of like, oh, we're doing utility maximization or something like that. But no, I mean, the way our cognition and motivation actually works is like we have these archetypes and we're trying to exemplify them and live by them. And even if you're like a utilitarian that doesn't believe in archetypes, the funny thing is that the archetype that you're trying to embody is, the god of utilitarianism, which itself, like, it's an archetype still. There's no way of escaping it. Like, I think it's important to realize that. Now, the Psyche, which is kind of like stands below Eros, is essentially the network of Eros imagery, how they are strung together. Just now, I realized, like, yeah, I mean, like, there's an overlap. There's a lot of slides shares between this presentation and another one. But yeah, I'll get to actually some novel content just for those who saw already the previous one. But okay, as an aside, Psyche essentially is the way in which the Eros imagery is interconnected. And usually the way in which that will be done is through narrative and storytelling. It's how the archetypes fit together. So you could actually have like two people who have like very similar Eros imagery, but their psyche is different because they're the web of meaning is different, and that's also important. Um, in a sense, Eros imagery is elaborated. The psyche is almost kind of the exegesis of the Eros imagery. Is how does it fit together into my life and the world. Um, and finally, logos is essentially your highest level conception of reality. It's kind of the conceptual framework upon which everything fits. And that is really, really, really deep. And like we don't realize in a sense like how much of kind of like logos underlies our experience. I mean, even things as basic as kind of like the perception of self and other relies on background philosophical assumptions, or your conception of time, or your conception of, where does yourself end and where does it start, like that also kind of like depends on your logos. So yeah, I mean, it's these deep ontological views about reality, views on questions like nature of self and other, the source of value, what is value, what is valuable, the level of abstraction that counts as real. Is like, are patterns real? Is physics real? Are souls real? Is God real? Like, what is the ontological status of all of those things? Core beliefs, intuitions, tacit assumptions. And yeah, I mean, where there is fantasy and love, logos is always involved. Basically, it's kind of behind the veil, so to speak. Like something is behind the love of something is wrapped up love for ideas. So logos has to be there for kind of the fire to flow. And if the Eros imagery doesn't connect with your logos, it's not going to work. I mean, and you can see this with atheism, for example. Like, yeah, if you actually don't believe in God, it's going to be hard for you to have Jesus as kind of the Eros imagery. It just doesn't flow. The energy doesn't flow because the logos as an operating system doesn't support the Jesus character. In that sense, the aesthetic is not going to work out unless you patch it up in different ways. Now, here's an important kind of observation or insight. I believe that largely most conflicts in society are actually pointless. Why? Because what's actually going on is that you have people who have disparate and different Eros imagery, and they don't realize this. Essentially, again, because an aesthetic makes you confuse what's beautiful with what is true. You consider whatever, honor, duty, or like family, whatever you may consider as like inherently, the thing that is valuable and true, not realizing that it's actually Eros imagery inside you. So when you have like two people who like talk and they say a word with a particular intonation and they react badly to that, with emotional reactivity, it's very likely the case that there's a mismatch in Eros in those two persons. And because you don't know it, there's a bunch of dissonance, and you kind of think, well, the other person must be a bad person because they're not resonating with the thing I'm resonating. This causes friction. The friction actually degrades the quality of the discourse, makes you very upset and so on. So it actually just makes it worse. So essentially, debates and fights at the level of Eros, I think, are pointless. They're like net negative. Now, you could also have a kind of like battle at the level of Psyche, which is a little bit more productive. And if you do that, you will kind of like try to harmonize the situation with kind of a shallow attempt, via storytelling. It's like, oh, well, maybe we can like string together our Eros imagery in a way that kind of like satisfy both of our needs. But really, I think like if you actually want to kind of like make progress, you have to go to the level of logos. You have to understand why is it that your archetypes can run in your operating system and they can't in mine. And if you have a deep enough understanding of that, you will, in a sense, realize, okay, like we have to either agree to disagree, or we have to talk about philosophy, or we have to, I don't know, trip together. Like we have to do something like pretty kind of like deeper level of kind of harmonization at the level of logos. Okay, so let's now kind of like give you examples, and I'm building up to kind of like the theory of art and how hopefully to save save the planet. Okay, so perfumes revisited, natural versus synthetic. So these are just kind of two very different aesthetics. There's a lot of people I encounter, right? Like, I mean, I'm a fan of smells, and a lot of people are like very into natural. They say like, oh, I don't like that perfume. It's very synthetic, smells very synthetic, whatever. The problem is they essentially rely on kind of like fundamentally different aesthetics. And like, at the levels Eros, the natural aesthetic kind of like the imagery is that they love is kind of nature and essences, healing energy, the good life. And actually, if you talk to somebody who deeply believes in the natural aesthetic, they will say, yeah, there's like an essence to lavender. When you're smelling lavender, you're like actually getting in contact with the essence of lavender. Something that, come on, like actually, if you know any chemistry, you will realize, well, actually, lavender is a bunch of different molecules put together, and the way in which it smells has to do with the precise proportion between them. And you can alter it. You can adulterate lavender. You can fix it in slightly this direction, that direction. There's no hard boundary that says like this is lavender, this is not lavender. It's actually a fuzzy boundary. So essences of that sort, they fundamentally don't exist. But you're required to kind of fabricate this this idea of an essence if you want to kind of like live in the natural aesthetic. At the level of psyche, usually the natural aesthetic will have ideas of kind of the web of life, how things are interrelated, how each plays a role. I mean, like if you buy a kit of essential oils, oftentimes you will come with a little card that says lavender for relaxation, citrus for waking up, cedar for joy, as if there was some kind of preordained order of like, yes, everything will have its function or something like that. Whereas, yeah, I mean, the synthetic aesthetic would say like, no, like we can develop control over nature, understand synergies, go to neuroscience, make sense of these. And finally, at the level of logos, which is actually what's, making these aesthetics alive, it's, the natural one is going to believe in like spirits and energies, purpose, teleology, nature as the best medicine, a bunch of things of that nature. Whereas, yeah, I mean, synthetic aesthetic would say like, no, actually there's like molecules and atoms and functional groups. And what's actually beautiful is if we can understand these smells at that level of organization. And in that sense, yeah, just almost irreconcilable unless you kind of like fix or change the logos of those two participants. This is just an extreme example in my travel to Mexico this winter. There's this stand of in Tepoztlan, a town near Mexico City, people selling honey, natural honey. And yeah, basically they like all of this is kind of the natural aesthetic is like, yeah, of course, like, it's going to help with tiredness. It's going to fortify cells. It goes against weakness. Cures depression, a bunch of things that, yeah, I mean, if you kind of have a scientific perspective, it's like you've got to back this up with studies. This seems very unrealistic and not, yeah. Anyway, potencias energéticas, energetic powers. So that's kind of how they conceptualize what the honey is doing. Whereas, yeah, no, if you have kind of a scientific world picture kind of perspective, you will, yeah, think of like, okay, what are the actual molecules in it, and like can we break it down that way? Now, this is a stand in the room of a friend of mine, like all-time friend. This is just to kind of like illustrate what like different aesthetics look like. So I was talking about the natural versus aesthetic. So let's kind of like try to talk about it. What is this? Like, what kind of person has a stand that is full of these things? Okay, it's full of mathematical objects and kind of like various elements and chemicals and Rubik's cubes. A different part of the same room is like, okay, there's these pure elements, these crystals, minerals. And here's like plants. A very funny thing is these plants are actually kind of like rescued from the streets. That they would be considered weeds naturally, but like he, values them. Is like, oh, let me give you a home, and like actually learn about the botanical, what is their actual scientific name and how they live and so on. Okay, so like what kind of a person would do these? Well, I would kind of like start to hint at this is getting into what I might describe as the elemental aesthetic. It might actually be kind of like even deeper than kind of just a basic scientific world picture aesthetic. Is kind of like trying to find what is like the true essential makeup of reality. And yes, it's going to be made of like things like DNA and like mathematical structures and elements, like raw elements. Okay, and this is my friend. I don't know if you might have guessed that this is what he looks like, but okay, like the whole aesthetic kind of hangs together in a way. and guess what? He's playing with this software called processing. He's making some trippy patterns and like trying to hack perception. So okay, like that type of person, the whole thing hangs together, right? Like hangs together in a Gestalt, and I'll describe it as a elemental aesthetic. It's a strong aesthetic. So for his birthday, as a gift, for example, I gave him a tungsten cube and synthetic ruby, synthetic sapphire. And the fact that that is a synthetic sapphire, synthetic ruby, it's a plus. Is like for a lot of people, it's like, no, this ideal is like mined from like the mines in Africa, like it actually involved human labor and it's a natural thing. Like, no, like chemically speaking, a ruby is a ruby. It doesn't matter if you made it in a lab or like you made it in the ground. It's actually even more beautiful if you made it in a lab, because it means you understand it. It means like, and it's physically the same. The quantum properties are literally the same. You could use it for the same purposes. And he gave me as a kind of like as a gift a little not a particular knot that he made with a chain. And anyway, like, so this is just to illustrate, okay, there's this elemental aesthetic. It's a possibility. And in a sense, like if you dive deeper into that, okay, like there are people who, for example, really cherish like dynamic systems and visualizing them. And again, like if somebody's into this, that's obviously a window into their logos, right? Like that, this is not a person who believes in animism and natural energies, or there's a bunch of other things that kind of like come along with it. There's this overarching, Mike Johnson calls it the one true ontology aesthetic, which okay, we've kind of described it as kind of compressing everything to a single principle. Here are just some examples of that aesthetic in play, which is this article by Nathaniel Travis. Is human behavior just elaborate running and tumbling? It's just like trying to break down all human behavior into just this very simple set of two differential equations that is exactly the same algorithm that bacteria follow in order to get to food. And he presents a lot of evidence that, yeah, that's all that we're doing. We just don't know it because we're in a much more complex system and environment. Another one is like Stephen Lehar with harmonic resonance theory. He also, I would describe as like, yeah, one true ontologist. Is like, can we understand the nervous system just as the interplay of resonances? It's like, yeah, you can go very far by just like looking at it that way. Or down there, David Pierce. He has this theory of like why there's something rather than nothing that boils down to this idea that actually the reason why we exist is because there's zero information. And he just derives everything from like math to consciousness to physics from just the principle of zero information. So that's kind of like an even more refined version of an elemental aesthetic, right? It's kind of like the one true ontology aesthetic. Is like, let's try to understand everything with as few principles as possible. And obviously, I love that stuff. There's obviously the risk of underfeeding, that like the principles that you're suggesting are just actually not enough to make sense of everything, but you can go really far. And this, I think, is like very essential to be a good scientist, is to try to explain things with as few principles as possible. Also kind of elaborate on December, and I've been doing this at parties and events. Essentially, I give a make your own scent workshop, like exploring the state space of scents. And it's also kind of this very elemental raw aesthetic, because it's like, okay, let's use actual molecules and see what happens when you combine them together. This was at Vision Weekend. I'll keep doing it. If you go to one of my events in the future, probably you'll get to experiment with scents, and I'll guide you through that space. Like for example, here we're getting into this aesthetic I call essentially mapping the state space of consciousness, because okay, like we're trying to understand the deep structure of reality, and part of the deep structure of reality is what is the set of possible qualia values and qualia varieties and their interrelationship. And yeah, I mean, like you see like the string, the row of little bottles, each one is very, very similar to the one next to each other. There's like only like slightly different in proportion. So you may not even notice the difference between two adjacent bottles. But if you kind of like do a jump of 3 or 4, they will start to smell pretty different. So that's a way of kind of like exploring the state space of scent with one just noticeable difference step at a time. Which, yeah, is kind of like in this exotic aesthetic. So now let's kind of like apply all of these to what, basically QRI's models of art. And I'm only going to go through like some of them because it's would be too much otherwise. But basically the more interesting ones, which are the upper 4. So the elemental aesthetic, the aesthetic of the exploration of sense that I was explaining, that's what I call the rainbow god aesthetic. Essentially, you're interested in the state space of consciousness. You're interested in every possible experience and charting it and mapping it out and understanding it. I think like, that I consider that a somewhat fairly advanced version of art, because you're not attached to the patterns anymore. You regard them as kind of like facts of nature. And then rather than like, oh, let's find a few patterns and like wrap my ego around it, is like, no, let's explore the entire space. It doesn't belong to anybody. In some sense, it is us. We are, we are that qualia. It's kind of a process of self-discovery rather than self-fabrication. And yeah, it involves, yeah, basically charting out states of color, of sense, of emotions, and so on. And the next one is essentially art as kind of a messing with the energy parameter. Essentially, it's not only about exploring this range of possible experiences. There's also something special about high energy experiences. And roughly speaking, I would say that a successful art, by and large, messes with what we call the energy parameter. And there's many ways of doing that. I mean, like you can, get energized in a concert because there's like light and sound and vibration, and it's all kind of like happening together. One way of energizing your nervous system. But you can also energize your nervous system with very surprising patterns. I mean, basically, what is surprising is energizing. And there's a very deep reason for that. I mean, the brain is constantly trying to make predictions, making the best predictions possible. And essentially when it's energized, is in kind of this ambiguous state where it hasn't decided what is it that it's experiencing. So what is surprising is inherently is energizing. So surprise is one way of kind of messing with the energy parameter. And yeah, I mean, psychedelics is like a super clear way of doing that. If you take LSD or something like that, it will energize your consciousness, which I think like is why, in a sense, yeah, like LSD pairs so well with art in general, because you will kind of like experience the same patterns, but in a surprising, energized, enhanced way. And this is pretty straightforward from kind of like tracer effects as I'm showing here. Even more extreme, like super powerful energizers of consciousness would be DMT. DMT I classify it as, it has two main effects. One is it activates high frequency metronomes that energize your experience. The second one, it makes it easier for elements of your consciousness to resonate with one another. So those two core effects put together essentially gives rise to, yeah, these complex symmetries and harmonizations of very energized patterns, which, yeah, I mean, there's a very, very tight interface between that and very high level artistic experiences. Then the next one is, yeah, this concept of art as like messing with valence, essentially things that have like interesting valence effects. Is like, why is this sound and this color and this smell, why do they feel so good when they are put together? And in a sense, the artist is kind of not only mindlessly exploring the states of consciousness, is also kind of like focusing on those that have like interesting emotional effects. And from this point of view, actually, this whole concept of annealing, neural annealing, where basically being in an energized state of consciousness makes you more flexible, allows the representations to be kind of like they become active. You can merge them and bring them together. Interesting, I guess it's kind of like chemistry, actually, where a lot of like molecules at room temperature, they don't interact. But if you increase the temperature, they may react with each other, right? Like you get like new things happen, new molecules. Likewise, there are a lot of mental constructs that like at room temperature, like in normal state of consciousness, they don't interact very much. You go to an art exhibit and you feel inspired, all of a sudden those constructs start to interact and your mind becomes more malleable. And so that's annealing. That's annealing. Especially as you cool down, those structures created in the energized state actually, and you can experience them in that way. And this, yeah, ultimately connects with the symmetry theory of valence, kind of a rabbit hole, but I mean, roughly speaking, good art will function by principles of harmony and balance and smoothness, invariance upon transformation, and it's going to try to smooth out essentially pinches and cuts, discontinuities, sharp gradients. And yeah, I mean, essentially, you can use things like pinches and cuts and dissonances and so on to increase the energy parameter. I mean, like noise music, for example, very harsh music, are ways of increasing the energy parameter. But then if you actually want to kind of like end up in an inspired, beautiful state, you have to kind of like transmute that energy into actually something pleasant and smooth. And some artists more or less successful at that. Not all, genres are like as good at it. So yeah, I mean, if you're interested in kind of this paradigm, I recommend the article by Michael Johnson, Neural Annealing. Also, I gave a presentation at the STOA on the theory of neural annealing, and also Quentin Frederick gave a more technical, less kind of intuitive, just much more technical version of it. You can find it in the QRI channel. And this is just for those who are watching the video afterwards, can pause and kind of examine this theory and structure and see if it makes sense. I would claim that, from the point of view of art as kind of like annealing effects and like valence effects, 5-MeO DMT is probably the most aesthetic experience you can have, because it's the most powerful, in that, as far as I can tell, way of like re-annealing your nervous system, where essentially all of your experience becomes completely smooth and completely energized, and you kind of like shake off all of the pinches and imperfections and discontinuities. And in some sense, like, presumably this is kind of the pinnacle of art from a certain perspective, the pinnacle of aesthetic experiences. And also it interfaces with the logos. I mean, like, other aesthetics may consider what reality is made of as essentially kind of like, whatever is in their eros and logos and so on. But somebody who just came down from a 5-MeO DMT experience will know that there's also this thing called pure consciousness, or consciousness without an object, consciousness without a content. And that is kind of like maybe, the central point of reality, kind of like the absolute center, the point of absolute reference, that from which everything else is derived. And in that sense, if you want to understand reality, unknowing that point is absolutely essential. And this is maybe kind of to illustrate. My friend Adrian in Mexico, from an art exhibit, this is kind of like maybe what successful annealing would look like. You're kind of like, there's a lot of cold work, stress patterns in your nervous system. You energize it, and then you cool down, and you go from this kind of like very rough and intricate stressed structure to this like smooth annealed structure where you feel just so much better. Energy flows just so much better. And in the extremes, I mean, basically valence as kind of like essential for aesthetics. To some extent, like the intensity and power of an aesthetic will be very related to what is the highest level of valence that it can access. And in that sense, this kind of like pain and pleasure scales become very, very relevant. And finally, which is getting to the aesthetic of the meta-aesthetic, I'm going to be wrapping up pretty soon. I think that you can take all of these insights, like, Eros, Psyche logos, as well as like exploring state space of consciousness and energy and annealing, and realize all of these gives us the elements to figure out how aesthetics can actually dialogue with one another. Like, predictably, like aesthetic A and aesthetic B, they will not get along together, even though maybe they both, have a function, even though they both actually probably like might be helpful, or there might be good communities that could produce particular kinds of value. And we probably shouldn't have the ideology of, let's just try to merge them, because oftentimes that's just not going to work. It's just going to generate a lot of dissonance. Instead, it's like, let's find their proper place. And let's kind of like create this structure where adjacent aesthetics that do interact with one another do get along together. And in that way, as a macro structure, that would be kind of the harmonic society, the aesthetic of the meta-aesthetic, where all of the aesthetics are actually in a good place. They all are respected, they all add value, and they all get along together. So that's kind of the image, Eros imagery for harmonic society, all of the aesthetics collaborating and getting along together well. I'll just briefly mention a couple theories. So basically, if you want to kind of like interface with aesthetics, neural annealing is very helpful. So for example, you need to experience images and archetypes in a fairly high energy state if you want to kind of anneal them as your archetypes. Like, I mean, that's why it's not only an intellectual thing, right? Like, you actually need to experience it at a high energy level if you want to embody those archetypes, which is why, concerts and trance and meditation are so essential to actually cultivate an aesthetic. I'll leave it at that for the time being. Another like important kind of exploration of possible aesthetics, I recommend, this short story that I wrote, Burning Man Theme Camps, is kind of exploring like what future more advanced aesthetics, more refined aesthetics, what they might look like. So another exploration. I would actually encourage you, like, rather than like writing a manifesto of like, this is my aesthetic and it's gonna win, why don't you write kind of like short stories or essays outlining different aesthetics and kind of like analyzing their pros and cons to kind of like signal, this like willingness to cooperate, and that you're not, gonna be belligerent about one particular aesthetic only. I mean, cultivating an aesthetic, you need to forge Eros with high valence, high energy experiences. You need to network a psyche with coherence, integration, and smart transitions. And you need to build a logos with equanimity, basically that accepts and seeks what is true. Like if you want to arrive at a good aesthetic. Um, One of these last concepts is basically the difference between open aesthetics and closed aesthetics. I think is very essential. So a closed aesthetic would be one that can't escape, its own system of meaning. And I would say it's probably good not to, get closed up in an aesthetic. And oftentimes this is going to be aesthetics that promote a lot of kind of a stressed out neurotic patterns, because that will prevent you from kind of updating, versus like an open aesthetic, one that can actually update itself. You can even use this term, it's computationally complete. There's some aesthetics that are actually so broad and capable of updating themselves, they can actually explore consciousness. They can actually analyze other aesthetics and transcending and including them, as people in spiral dynamics would say. And this brings about, this concept of a super cooperator cluster, which would be a set or group of aesthetics that can cooperate with each other in net positive games, and the aesthetic of the meta aesthetic, as I explained. The proposed meta aesthetic that I have essentially, and I think maybe I'll leave it for questions, but essentially I think if we can like mix together these logos of math, monism, and valence, and the Eros imagery of rainbow god, essentially exploring all consciousness, health, and loving kindness. I think these are really good elements. I mean, like they're not enough, but I think they're like a really, really good start. And also this conception that, I mean, ultimately, art is for the sake of universal consciousness. It's kind of this, disidentification process. In some sense, like samadhi as a work of art, or God as the consumer of art, as it were. I think that might be kind of a helpful way of, essentially not getting too caught up in your particular aesthetic. And with that, again, this symbol to kind of keep it in your mind. And these are just some examples of like Soulmaking at QRI, like QRI Party 2021, I believe. Kind of all of these elements, like obviously there's kind of like trying to make it kind of like beautiful and pleasant, but also, like legitimately a lot of like content that like synergizes together. And they're all about kind of the meta aesthetic. All of these is about like not just sticking to one known aesthetic or fostering it. Is like, how do we disentangle ourselves from it and kind of analyze them from a more objective point of view. And with that, let's seek the balance of forces rather than just the domination of one. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Wow, man, super awesome talk. Yeah, man. Anybody who's got any questions, please, think of them, get them ready, and jump in. I've got a question though to start with. Now, I thought about like utilitarianism and how to couch aesthetics in in an ethical framework. But often with utilitarianism, the measure is just a simple 1 degree axis, like of happiness and sadness or flourish. Yeah. So but the idea is to make it so everybody as happy as possible. But the word happiness to me isn't really as useful just describing, I guess, this whole vista of possible experience. But like a word like novelty might get closer to that. Do you think you could couch or frame this sort of ethical frame this this aesthetics framework in an ethics sort of thing? Would you be able to, like, the types of aesthetics that can coordinate and cooperate with each other, novelty seeking behavior instead of just being locked into just smiley faces for time and all eternity and all that sort of thing? Yeah, if you were to sort of frame this in an ethical way, how would you do that, if you think it's possible?
Sure. There's so much in there. I mean, first of all, I will say, I mean, I guess my cards on the table, like I am kind of a one true ontologist, as it were. Like I do try to kind of like break down reality in as few set of principles as possible. And I do think like valence is like very critical. but I don't use the word happiness because happiness, yeah, has a lot of connotations. In some sense, valence is kind of clean because it's like a technical term from affective psychology, and like it doesn't sound like you're advocating for a particular kind of like dystopian future where we're all injecting heroin all the time or something like
Yeah.
that. Uh, but essentially, valence is like, I would say, like an umbrella term because meaning, like a lot of people will say, like, I don't care about happiness, I care about meaning. Well, as I understand it, essentially, highly meaningful experiences are very high valence. They actually feel very good. It's just that the way our minds are constructed is kind of paradoxical because you're required to kind of believe that that meaning is intrinsic and inherent and kind of outside of you, and you're interfacing with it for it to produce the positive feeling. So if all of a sudden you feel like, oh gosh, like this meaning thing is just kind of a like it's just a trick to make me feel happy, the trick stops working. So that's also, I think, like explains a little bit like defensiveness from people because like I guess in comedy or things like that, like sometimes like when you explain it, the trick stops working. So um, yeah, a lot of defensiveness might kind of like come down to that. Is like, yeah, don't explain it because otherwise I'm not going to be able to derive the meaning I want to. Um, Obviously, I think in religion this is very very related to that. Um, and I would imagine, I mean, in your mind, probably novelty is part of the Eros imagery. I will mention. I mean, I have absolutely no problem with that. I'll kind of like just like take one step back and say um, it's important to kind of like analyze aesthetics in terms of not only how true they are, but also what are the fruits that they generate. And arguably, yes, I mean, if you have like a community of smart people who do consider novelty part of their Eros imagery, they're, yeah, likely going to be much more like innovative, and they're much more likely to actually move forward, not get stuck in silly attractors. And in that sense, yeah, they're like vastly more equipped to explore the state space and find things that are like legitimately super valuable. um, I would personally maybe suspect there's no intrinsic value to novelty, but I think like its pragmatic value is just so strong that I definitely fully endorse kind of like, you know, forging your soul making with novelty as an element in it. Um, and I guess like another comment I'll make here is I do think like utilitarianism in some formulations is just like semantically like trivially true. Like, okay, like it's just kind of math. It's just like, okay, there's numbers and numbers are real and like quantities are real. And like obviously if you assign value to something, the more of it you have, like obviously like the better it is. Like um however, this does not feel good in the human mind. And I think it's an aesthetics problem because it really interfaces with a lot of our like hardwired circuits for example, like family and prioritizing those who are like our genetic kin, those who can reciprocate. You add utilitarianism to that, it's like an acid bath into that that structure of meaning, and very unpleasant for a lot of people. Which I think is like, okay, like ideally you become kind of an advanced meditator and you realize with equanimity, like hold on a second, the semantic structure versus how it feels that are different. You can still cultivate even virtue. You can be a virtue ethicist in how you feel and how you approach life, but still in the back of your mind being a utilitarian from the point of view of like semantics and, yeah, like a deeper understanding. And that's a sort of like move that I would advocate for, not just getting so caught up in like, no, utilitarianism everywhere or virtue
I totally
everywhere.
agree with that. Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. It'd be nice to be able to like sort of beautify utilitarianism, so it
Oh
would be
yes.
absolutely like people would just like it a lot more instead of see it as just a bunch of equations or a big spreadsheet or something like that. So yeah, but I mean, I guess you could put wrappers around it in a sense to
Yeah.
make it more attractive, more like a
Yeah.
honeypot towards the truth. Yeah.
I mean, I think that's that's fascinating. I thought of like how you just said it, like, yeah, beautifying utilitarianism as a cause area, in in EA or something like that. Um, I mean,
Indeed,
I think
yes.
my perspective is that open individualism is very essential here. I mean, and also like that's why like Goldilocks Zone of One is I prefer it because it's not as shocking. I mean, it is like, yes, like okay, let's also respect our individuality, our humanity, and so on. but also like there's a point of view from which, yeah, we are all one consciousness, and in that sense, like utilitarianism kind of follows naturally, because if we're all one consciousness, like you're actually also the anonymous cow, like number, 5 million and something, like stuck in a factory farm. So it's like not only like ethical but also rational to try to, yeah, essentially rescue other sentient beings. um, and that can be pretty beautiful from certain points of view, although it's not going to be everybody's taste for sure.
Yeah, we can all join in on the becoming part of the one big utility monster, right?
Yes.
Uh, since there's nothing else, if we're all part of the one consciousness, all part of the one sort of being, then and then why not? Let's all be the one utility monster, the big organism. Has anybody else got any questions though? Like I don't want to dominate question time. Asher, yeah, just please unmute.
Hey, yeah, really good presentation. I watched the one on YouTube, but this one was also really good, so glad that I made it. Yeah, I just had a question somewhat related to using, I guess, like neural annealing, high energy states of consciousness as a means to kind of escape a closed aesthetic that someone's trapped in. So, sometimes that happens, but sometimes people, take psychedelics or something like that, and then that will just like reinforce an aesthetic that they already have, or maybe they'll just like have a crazy shift from one aesthetic, say like a really scientific aesthetic or whatever, to taking ayahuasca and then becoming super spiritual and totally abandoning the previous, maybe their previous model or frame of understanding reality. And so essentially, yeah, what's going on there? And maybe is this just a failure of like having different modes, sorry, different frames or models to like interpret their experience, or yeah.
No, it's a, yeah, excellent question. So there's a lot there. I will say 100%, like specific psychedelics. I mean, all psychedelics are energizing. Like I think like that's like all psychedelics intensify consciousness, increase the total amount of qualia that you have per per moment of experience, per like time slice. Um, and in that sense, they all will tend to dissolve the structures that you have constructed in everyday life. However, you may be in a sense replacing the evolutionary selection pressures for particular patterns of thought that we normally experience with other ones that in a sense are capable of reinforcing different patterns of thought. And also because it happens in a high energy environment, they may anneal like much more deeply. So yeah, I mean, if you have like an ayahuasca experience where you talk to the spirit of the tree, that might form a very deep imprint, and it's just gonna, yeah, basically get in your web of meaning and like be something you'll have to deal with. It's like, yeah, how do I explain that? And probably you will either have to reject it, which is going to be unpleasant, or you will have to embrace it, which will make you delusional. So there's kind of not an easy way out of kind of like that type of like annealing problems. But so essentially it's like, okay, hugely important to set and setting. Ideally also we would develop a scientific understanding of like what are these evolutionary selection pressures that are specific to each, psychedelic, to each combination, to each state of consciousness, so that we can navigate the failure modes. And like, I mean, legitimately, I mean, for example, LSD bad trips are a real thing, and very unpleasant and can be traumatizing. So like ideally is like if you're noticing the signs of like, okay, like I'm starting to fall into that attractor, we would actually know a way to kick you out of that attractor with like the right music, the right vibration, or the right booster of drug or whatever it may be. And so I think like in a very real sense, we just lack like knowledge here, and it may take like maybe even like hundreds of years to like fully like deeply understand like what's going on here. That said, you will generally have like just more flexibility. So like if you do start with a set and setting where, for example, you're actually aware of like the theory of neural annealing, during the ayahuasca experience, during the LSD trip, you will know like, okay, now I'm like, there's some risk that I'm reinforcing this delusion or this pattern. And you can like kind of like still in that highly flexible state, like choose to do something else. And that's going to be helpful. The last thing I'll mention is that, no, two more things. very critical is like the hedonic tone. So essentially, I am an advocate for like, let's have like good psychedelic experiences. I mean, like there are like the healing of trauma may involve like some moments of like despair, and like that might be kind of inevitable. But by and large, in terms of like exploring, in terms of healing, in terms of like feeling good, good annealing, the more time you can spend in a blissful state on a psychedelic experience, the better it's going to be. So like try to maximize the conditions for that. And then like, even if you have like some delusions that get formed, at least, you know, they're very beautiful and they're, you know, very healing and consonant with your sense of, with your nervous system. And now the last thing I'll mention is, there are specific drugs though that I think like do have the tendency to actually kind of like defabricate any kind of aesthetic. And I would say, yeah, 5-MeO DMT is like special here. It's not just another psychedelic. That like the typical effect of 5-MeO DMT is, rather than like the construction of, you know, complex conceptual structures you anneal to, it's just the defabrication of your normal constructions, your normal aesthetic, and kind of like reconnection with like pure consciousness, which again, like a lot of people may be skeptical, like pure consciousness, is that real? Is that significant? I mean, the answer is yes, super important, but you kind of need to experience it to know what I mean. And likewise, in kind of that category, I would say like other things that are like not as risky would be like in that sense. I mean, they may be risky for other reasons, but MDMA and ketamine, like they tend to have more of this kind of defabrication effect, as opposed to, I mean, frankly, ayahuasca is like, no, you're probably going to be fabricating these complex hyperdimensional worlds, and yeah, they will leave a very big imprint on you.
Excellent question. Anybody else? Well, I mean, let's just say like somebody wants to experience something along the lines of 5-MeO DMT, but doesn't have access to that, or just doesn't want to engage in, I don't know, drugs or the process of finding this sort of thing on the black market. What can people do if they want to do something, you know, if they want to just pursue natural means, or natural, just I guess non-drug oriented means of achieving these forms of state spaces of experience?
Yeah, so the the thing that I've been gathering from talking to a lot of people, for example, talking to Shenzhen Yang. Shenzhen Yang is like super accomplished, yeah, Zen meditator, and he wrote the book The Science of Enlightenment. I have it right there. Great, amazing guy, and he's like currently investigating how to use ultrasound stimulation in order to generate like high levels of equanimity in a reliable way, targeting a very specific part of the brain. Basically, his idea is that of all of kind of the insights and constructs that you can do on meditation, a lot of them are very helpful. I mean, for example, I'm a big advocate of loving kindness. Like if you do loving kindness meditation 10 minutes a day, you're gonna be happier. I mean, I suspect it's, or 99% of people will be happier. Like I strongly recommend it, but it's not necessarily the best. I mean, like it might be the fastest to kind of like some good effects. Shenzhen Yang would say, well, the long road, but that actually takes you all the way, is equanimity. And equanimity is essentially having this approach to pain and pleasure, where you neither seek it nor you deject it. Essentially, you just embrace whatever happens in kind of like as kind of neutral way as possible. Some people, I don't know, I think like Ayn Rand used to say like Buddhism is the philosophy of death or something like that. Because like this sounds like you're just becoming neutral. You're just like not feeling anything anymore. That's false. Equanimity is not dissociation. It's actually embracing all feelings, but it has this paradoxical effect that like nominally what you're supposedly doing is not caring about valence, pleasure and pain, but the result of doing that practice is that you actually elevate your well-being because you're much better at absorbing stresses in life. You're able to metabolize them. And essentially, yeah, he actually recently tried 5-MeO DMT. He tried like a range of doses, all the way up to like full ego death. And basically his assessment was 5-MeO DMT takes you to the exact same place as high-end equanimity practice, like all the way to kind of, super ascetic practices that the Zen Buddhist would do, kind of like 100 days of extremely strenuous physical exercises and fasting and all sorts of, or like showering in like super cold water like 5 times a day, like things like that. After 100 days of that, you may have like these ego death experiences. He says like, yeah, 5-MeO DMT is that. He's actually pointing in that direction, which is very different than like what LSD or MDMA or whatever may be generating. But you can cultivate equanimity without like going so extreme, and like even just like having a cold shower every day with this mindset of neither stalling nor flinching, just kind of like embracing the feeling. That is like pointing in that direction. And or for example, a strong determination practice where like you literally don't move at all for like 1 or 2 hours in meditation. That is also pointing in the direction of equanimity. And 5-MeO DMT is kind of there. And there's like some beautiful meditation guided, like there's one I did recently by Michael Taft about equanimity that I think it actually gets to like the 5-MeO DMT qualia. So I would recommend checking that out.
Well, that's interesting. Yeah, I guess I've tried this sort of practice that is just embracing pain. For instance, if I'm doing a hit, I do still feel as though it's difficult. I haven't gotten to the habit of really being able to do it without being totally embracing of the pain. But it's fun to try, but it does require a lot of willpower, I tell you. It really does.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm not speaking from like, I mean, obviously at times I feel like a hypocrite because I'm not like an enlightened being or anything like that. I'm more of a geek about like these practices, and I do have some experience, but it's not like I'm like super practiced or anything. But from my experience, it does get a lot easier over time. And essentially, it's kind of like you build up to it. And like I think like a piece of advice I remember from Shensen Young was very helpful was when you do equanimity practice, you will notice that you don't have equanimity, but then the move to do is actually have equanimity about your lack of equanimity. So it's like you accept the fact that you're currently rejecting these. And that is kind of like, yeah, it starts very way on the top, but like it slowly trickles down all the way to where like you actually don't care.
Awesome. R2, did you have a question? I noticed you put your video on there for a second.
Yeah. I have a few questions. First of all, how stable do you think people's aesthetics are? Or can we differentiate like momentary aesthetics and like larger, like your life-shaping aesthetics and so on? And how rapid sort of movement between aesthetics do you see? Because I have these weird aesthetics I get drawn to. One is this very strong, like anti-aesthetic aesthetic that says that this is like this is a practical matter. Don't get like fooled by this like weird self-organizing thing going around and trying to draw you in. But then you sort of realize, okay, I'm talking in language and these like concepts that frame this like refusal to get drawn into aesthetics. That's like that has to be an aesthetic itself. There's like this weird, like closed individualist energy that like refuses to be drawn into the world, but simultaneously, because it's like it contains enough self-reflection, it has to like suddenly realize, no, that's an aesthetic too, and then it's cycles. And there's like one example where I can see like an aesthetic negating itself and then like reasserting itself, but like weirdly trying to reach sort of reflective equilibrium with itself, but being unstable at the same time.
Very interesting. Do you have any concrete example of that? If not, that's fine. I'm happy to address your first questions.
Well, yeah, I'm trying to avoid getting into that aesthetic because it's rather like angry also.
Okay.
like and afraid of all like art and such like treating them as this like vast strange force around us. And one example I remember one time when I hadn't slept well in like days, and I had this like sudden moment of clarity, like everything, like a painting on my wall I've painted with weird like symbolism, fishes and clock towers, and like the clothes I'm wearing, you know, this is all like contingent fluff. This can't have like any deeper meaning. And I don't know, I spent like a few hours like walking around in my apartment and like talking to myself, giving these lectures, like, look at this, these are books and they are like function like this, and they like are part of this sort of like global information and meaning creation process, and your life is just like this weird like occurrence. But then like it's a sort of like turned into itself, and yes, and also this like my reaction and this thing happening is also that so it doesn't like provide you like this neutral ground from which you could approach anything. I don't know if I'm like making sense here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so not entirely sure how to address that last part, but I will address the first part, and hopefully we can unravel it a little bit. So to a first approximation, I think that age is very key for like, the resilience of aesthetics. So essentially, I mean, to a first approximation, the younger you are, the higher your temperature parameter. So essentially, if you're like a teenager, you can pick up like post-rock 1 month, and then like go to like, I don't know, like 60s rock the next month, and you know, Christianity 1 month, and then you know, Hinduism the next month, and it's fine. Like it's just kind of like very flexible and malleable and so on. So age like matters a lot. I think like probably by the time you're like 40 or 45, things have like crystallized quite a bit. Depends on the personality. I mean, again, the energy parameter is different from person to person, their baseline. But to a first approximation, I would say like around like maybe the end of 30 or 40s or so on, things are like really crystallizing. I don't think it's realistic to change a person aesthetic if they're like 55. I think they're just from experience, like I've never been able to to successfully, you know, navigate a aesthetic disagreement with somebody who's like 55. It just doesn't happen unless they are very into psychedelics or very into meditation, because then that means they have access to like annealing technology, or they're like really open-minded to begin with. But like, again, that would be like 1% of the population or something like that, which is, yeah, I mean, like, it sounds like silly, but like honestly, if you want to change minds and hearts of the world and so on, probably targeting your message to people who are like in their early 20s is probably the best way to go. Because I mean, if you target it like too early, it's just gonna be a fad. It's just gonna be like, well, yeah, this is my flavor of the month. If you target too late, it's just never gonna stick. Probably early 20s or so is when people have like, okay, sophisticated enough models and enough flexibility that they actually can like, yeah, anneal into. And if you look around, okay, like religious conversions or interest in transhumanism or things like that, yeah, they tend to anneal around like early 20s. And that's, so yeah, college age is around the time of like maximum kind of a durability of whatever you actually think about and the aesthetic you assume. Now, I also do think there's going to be kind of a mature science of aesthetics will actually have like differential equations for all of these. It's like, okay, what is the rate of change of Eros imagery as a function of changing your environment? Yeah, I mean, all of these ultimately will compile to physics, I think, and electromagnetic fields and basically how rigid they are. Your Eros imagery is literally instantiated in my worldview like as like patterns of electromagnetic fields that are like in consonant resonant configurations. So yeah, I mean, like you literally need energy to like reshape them. Like it doesn't happen on its own. Like you literally need to like, yeah, change the field lines and modify them and so on. Yeah, something that you can, yeah, again, like feel very in a very embodied way on like meditation and so on. I think like the last thing I'll mention here, what was it? Oh yeah. I think like a very key component, I did not get into this in the presentation, is that a very big component of like an aesthetic is who is our inner audience. And like essentially that is also like, if your inner audience is like your mom who criticized you forever, never loved you or something like that, and like anything you do is like not enough and is bad, like yeah, that's going to influence tremendously, you know, like what do you perceive to be beautiful, what do you perceive to be good. Like maybe like 4 out of like 5 of your main inner audiences say like, wow, this is awesome, but your mom is there like shaking its head. Like it's going to continue to feel dissonant. So I do also think like cultivating good inner audience, like if there's somebody crazy in your life, demands like way too much, is like bipolar or borderline personality disorder, it's in your life or something, that is going to influence your aesthetic in a very negative way. So either like fix that, which is kind of unlikely, or probably you need to distance from that person if you actually want to be happy, because otherwise it's going to be part of your inner audience, and that's going to be problematic. So so inner audience is a key component as well, and that needs to be shifted if you want to shift your aesthetic.
Thank you.
That's so fascinating. Artu, did you want to come back at that? In the meantime, like yeah,
If no one else has asks a question, if someone has them, or I'll see the floor.
Oh yeah.
But yeah, it's very, very interesting in this, like inner audience. I have this weird relationship to both closed and open individualism. I think is very relevant here, because basically, like the route I arrived in open individualism is basically like as a very generalized sort of closed individualism. I tried into like determining what's the locus of my agency, because I thought it's important like to determine what to do and like how to protect myself and so on. But if you take that very seriously, you arrive at something like empty individualism in the end. Closed individualism just doesn't like hold together if you really try to look into it and take it seriously and take your like own like emotional reactions towards different views of personal identity seriously as like phenomena. They are also like caused by something, they have structure and so on. So but there's like this strange flickering thing where like the closed individualist view tries to reassert itself like as this very, very general like aesthetic, like where you are identified with like something like pure consciousness, but it turns out that pure consciousness is like flavored by you in a sense. And that's a weird place to be, because there's also like this strong moralistic element. If you're like a slightly closed individualist, open individualist, then open individualism starts seeming like this moral demand on you rather than like sort of realization. And I notice like I have this weird thing where I sometimes notice I become like literally stupid at times when I'm like taken over by these things. Like I think it's an objective feature, like my ability to like maintain cognitively complex like ideas simultaneously. Like it goes down, and this probably has something to do with Valence. Like these are stages when I'm like not feeling very well, but not necessarily like being like tired or like in pain, but I'm like experiencing some sort of like dissonance, and that makes me more close individualist, but not in the sense where like I think it's a general phenomenon when people like feel threatened, they like go into like slightly closed individual view for practical reasons. You are a biological organism, you are like programmed to protect yourself to an extent, but these are like strange phenomena and like have to do with my sense of like personal identity. It's a weird thing to think of yourself as having inhabiting these weird possible like attractor arrangements basically, which come with aesthetics or are activated by certain sort of aesthetics, which like leads you to a sort of meta aesthetic view, because in order to make sense of yourself as a person, if you like embody slightly different aesthetics, then you have to have like a meta aesthetic like view of yourself, because otherwise you're just like a random like a configuration of occurrences that don't make any like coherent sense, which in a sense might be like a pretty accurate description on some level. But if you want to have like agency coherence as your life and your actions, you have to have some sort of like meta aesthetics.
Yeah. So I know what you mean, and I think I remember like earlier in my journey philosophy, I remember like having very like just feel like not substances or anything, just philosophy, like having like very weird states while contemplating open individualism and things like that. Like some of them are kind of like weirdly paralyzing and bizarre. I understand what you mean. Like depending on the precise like hybrid that you have, they may interact in strange ways. So what I have to say here is I am very serious about like the Goldilocks zone of oneness being a good place. That like some people like get a taste of open individualism and are like, oh my gosh, this is it. Some other taste it and say like, oh, this is like scary as hell. And there's all kinds of reactions, and but usually it's kind of like an attractor. It's like, okay, like it's either like super strong there or not. So what I have to tell, like what I'm gonna tell the audience is like, there is something here in the Goldilocks zone of oneness where the forces are like carefully balanced. That is, how to say, like if the energy landscape is something like around the various hybrids, it kind of like it's unstable. There's kind of like a deep in right where you have the perfect balance between them. That is kind of actually like anti-fragile, and it's like, oh, okay, around here they're actually really harmonious and it's like stable. And I think, like, I mean, promisingly, I do suspect that we might be able to develop interventions to like show people the Goldilocks zone of oneness in a very blissful, beautiful way. Even on, for example, a ketamine trip is kind of like, oh, you examine what it feels like to be the entirety of space or consciousness, while also you have this feeling of individuality and also moments of experience, and they all cohabit, and then you anneal that. And it's going to be a very embodied, and it's like, oh my gosh, yes, this is a very precious new way of thinking of identity, and it's harmonious.
Fascinating. Hey, like a lot of people will look at this stuff and automatically reject it because it doesn't look as though they can see any sort of scientific pathway to seeing this. There may be some stuff in humanities, or maybe some stuff in some philosophy, but what do you see as the most promising research directions that can help even augment this this field of inquiry, but also legitimize it and even falsify aspects of it if need be?
Yeah, I mean, to a first approximation, I would say like studying neural annealing in a scientific way, and psychedelic research. Again, like, with kind of this like one true ontology aesthetic, where we don't care necessarily about the zoo of effects, the zoo of possible experiences. We care about like the fundamental effects and how they interact, which actually gives us the most leverage on how to modify the experience for its benefit. But I guess like besides that, I mean, yeah, I'm not sure. I would probably be rehashing things like the hedonistic imperative. So, but yeah.
Yeah, like I mean, like there's been some attention towards the measuring states of consciousness scientifically, like brain scanning and trying to make sense of how the brain produces qualia and all that sort of thing. I mean, yeah, information theoretic sort of pathways. Yeah. What do you think? I mean, what's the most fundamental research that you think is required to make better sense of what you've been talking about? The
Well,
for instance, open individualism and the Goldilocks zone of oneness.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on how deep you want to go, and like how much sci-fi technology is on the table.
Well, yeah,
Because
yeah.
like,
Exploratory engineering, like what we don't have today. What kinds of sensors, what types of measuring equipment, what types of science we may need to make sense of all this in the future. What do you think is
yeah,
plausible? What can you can
I
envision
think,
being plausible in the future?
I mean, for where I think like we will actually probably have a complete revolution in our conceptual, conceptual scheme is going to be when we visualize the structure of the electromagnetic field in the brain. Like not only like, oh, this part of the brain is like consuming more blood, or like, hey, like these are the oscillations of the the electric field in the scalp, or like the magnetic field with MEG in the scalp. More like, no, what is the actual topology of the electromagnetic field across the entire brain? And I think like when we can visualize that, we will see so many things very clearly. Like for example, why are you separate from the rest of the universe? I hypothesize, I predict it is because the electromagnetic field is actually generating a topological pocket that is topologically segmented out from the rest of the fields. And that is why, you're actually kind of like an individual in a certain sense, as opposed to like all of the universe all the time. Although it's kind of crazy because the thing that is animating you, the energy of the universe, as it were, is both inside and outside of you. So that's why it's kind of like, yeah, from a certain point of view, closed individualism is true, but from a different point of view, you're actually the universe, and like they're both perfectly compatible. You just need to kind of like abstract all that information and say like, well, actually they're both true. It just depends on how you look at it.
That's really fascinating. So I don't know about the technologies of today that would be able to measure, I guess, these states in the brain or in the skull or elsewhere. But I guess fMRI doesn't do it because that's just measuring metabolism. But maybe
Yep.
something like an advanced version of magnetoencephalography or
Yep.
stuff like that.
Yeah.
That's pretty expensive bit of equipment at the moment, but still, I mean.
Yeah. I mean, something like Neuralink, but for the entire brain, with like probes that are like measuring the electric and magnetic field, like equally spaced apart at a sufficiently high level of resolution. So you could actually visualize what's going on at every scale and everywhere in the brain. That, I think that's where, yeah, this is gonna become pretty apparent. But yeah, I don't know, like putting a ton of like tiny little threads everywhere in your brain was probably pretty disruptive, but like, yeah, I mean, it's gonna be experimented with animal models first, but yeah, that's that sort of technology I would expect.
Right.
Alternatively too, there might be ways of inferring the topology of the electromagnetic field from outside, especially if we can disrupt it. I mean, like one of the things I guess I talk about is like how transcranial magnetic stimulation, the story that we tell ourselves about it is like not, I don't think it's not that helpful. Where like oh, you're inducing this magnetic field in this part of the brain. Well, actually, transcranial magnetic stimulation is doing something crazier because it's also affecting the topology of the electromagnetic field. So then what you ideally would do is like model how various kinds of topologies induced by a transcranial magnetic stimulator might interface with other topologies inside the brain and see if that matches the predictions, or like it makes predictions that matches empirical data. But again, yeah, I mean, that requires very sophisticated neuroscience and very sophisticated physics to make sense. But yeah, I mean, eventually we'll figure it out, I'm sure.
God, I want to be around to see that. I think that'll be
Yes.
so fascinating.
Asher? Yeah.
Tony, Asher?
Oh, yeah, was Tony first?
I don't know if Tony was going to ask a question, but Asher, if you want to ask one now.
Yeah, sure. Hang on, I'll just post a little quote into the chat related to my question. So there's this from the 19th century. I think there are like various different sources as to where it came from, but it says, when a person disputes with his neighbor from their respective windows, why is there no chance of them being able to agree because they argue from different premises? And yeah, essentially my question was kind of, do you know of any strategies for like effectively communicating between, say, two aesthetics that are operating on fundamentally like different ontological assumptions, and especially when the people who are arguing from different aesthetics say, you know, they don't have a background in philosophy and they're not able to separate, you know, like, you know, look at the premises on which like the positions that they're arguing from, you know, are maybe like hierarchically kind of placed. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, like three heuristics. Number one is stress is the mind killer in this case. So like just don't like minimize stress, increase like stress dissipation capacity. But essentially, yeah, like find like there might like essentially like stress accumulates and like there's this I wonder if I have it here, but like there's kind of like this chart of like how like the sort of like social strategies that people adopt as a function of their level of stress, and essentially it goes from like yeah like calm, cooperative, to like irritated, to like you know aggressive, to hostile, all the way to I guess yeah like belligerent, and like and essentially like the crazy thing is like my understanding is that you will climb that scale independently of where the stress is coming from. So like maybe let's say our argument is causing like 20 units of stress, but let's say that I am also like hungover and I have like a heart problem or whatever. So there's like an additional like 60 units of stress. And like those two put together will already put me at a level much higher in the uncooperative scale. So even if you remove sources of stress that have nothing to do with the argument, that will help. That will be like useful. So kind of like having a good model of like why are these people like stressed will be helpful. Second one is like obviously if this is possible, you know, like taking MDMA together or something like that, like will help, and probably the solution will be more like oh let's just be friends and not argue, like rather than like solving it, because solving it will actually require like much more philosophical minds, I think. But pragmatically, I mean, just as how you actually deal with like abusive relationships in real life, separating the people is the first step. Because I mean, it's like if you have two toddlers fighting, right? It's like they're probably like there's no realistic outcome where like they will be able to resolve it. You first need to separate them, get them to calm down. Maybe a couple of years later, they might be able to talk about it and laugh about it and make sense of it. But I mean, realistically, when you have two persons like embodying incompatible aesthetics, they are like essentially possessed by an egregor, and like the egregors are like toddlers. So you have to separate them.
Like fascinated by this idea of providing like translations and mutual understanding between different aesthetics, like not just because, you know, I feel like I'm embodying like different aesthetics at time and sometimes they like fight, but it's a fascinating topic in general. I was wondering, this is probably just my background, but it's something I find intriguing. Raymond Smullin, in one of his books, I think it's Philosophy in the 5000 BC, has this, I think it's an epilogue or something, where he suggests that like some ways of viewing the world on a very deep level, they might actually be inconsistent with each other, like in a logical sense, but there might just be a translation between them. Like if you have like piano arithmetic, thinking that this other arithmetical theory is inconsistent and the other arithmetical theory thinks that piano arithmetic is inconsistent, they can both be consistent. And on, I don't think it actually, if they can be mutually interpretable in that case, actually, yes, probably because it's an inconsistency claim. But anyhow, the idea is that you might have like things that are actually inconsistent in some very fundamental sense, that there is no like this, like the ultimate aesthetic that each can sort of like incorporate every other aesthetic, but we might have like this very like richer structure of relations between different aesthetics. And set theorists today, they talk about, for instance, set theory geology, with like weird ideas where my model of sets might think your model is actually ill-founded. Your ordinals are not the real ordinals, and you will think that my ordinals are not the real ordinals. But we can still like use our respective ordinals like as measuring rods, for instance, your non-standard from my point of view, and the other way around. But that there is no like ultimate fact about it, whether you are right or I am right, but we can still mutually communicate, even though we think, like both of us think, like from our point of view, totally coherently and in a sense like correctly, that the other side is wrong. But this doesn't like preclude the possibility of actually communicating in a way where strangely we can sort of like agree locally whenever we meet, even though like globally there's an actual inconsistency, not just like a misunderstanding in a sense, but and this is like something I find really fascinating, because I noticed that some attractors or like aesthetics, they make very strong claims on my thinking. Like this is the ultimate sort of point of view from which you can understand other point of views. And of course, like the emergence of itself has to be explainable. Otherwise, you are not like even self-consistent. But
Yeah.
I'm just wondering if you have anything to say about this like dimension of it.
Yeah, I mean, I hypothesize the existence of a super sanity where there's ways of kind of like stacking the decks from the very beginning, where like you can actually embody complete, like supposedly incompatible aesthetics, but in a precise layout that they don't generate dissonance to each other. So maybe something like baking in the aesthetic of the meta aesthetic, like at the hardware level. I think it might be possible. I'm not sure if humans can do it, partly because I mean coalition building, chimpanzee factionalization and so on is just kind of hardwired, and like I'm not sure if we're like actually equipped with that. I mean, maybe Shenzhen Yang could do it, but like, or I don't know, somebody's like that, or we might just need to kind of like make ourselves kind of like bonobos in order to not by default get our aesthetics to fight each other so much. But yeah, I mean, I do hypothesize like super sanity. I suspect like things like MDMA are kind of getting there, where like the complete absence of fear essentially allows you to kind of see more objectively, like the pros and cons of the different aesthetics. And yeah, fear as well. I mean, stress and fear are very big mind killers in this case.
It makes me want to ask a silly question. Let's just say we did encounter an alien civilization that had evolved in like quite a different way, come from a completely different phylogenetic tree. They evolved on a planet with a completely different atmosphere, and I don't know, breathed lava, and whatever, something. Yeah, they were just like, but. Do you think that they'd have an aesthetic that could be compatible with ours? Do you think do you think there would be like naturally a completely different sort of magisterium of aesthetics that can't be bridged, or do you think that there would still be a way to sort of bridge these, and so they
wonderful
wouldn't be
question.
dissonant between each other?
My guess is that the number one factor will be what is their reproductive strategy, because again, like for evolutionary reasons, what helps you reproduce you consider to be true and good. So if there's like some isomorphism between the reproduction strategy and the human reproduction strategy, we will probably understand each other, at least like the feelings that we have and like why we have them, how they're connected to each other. If they have a very different, reproduct, like if they're kind of like ant colonies, for example, or like they're all like clones of each other, or there's like so many, or like if they use like three, like rather than like being two genders, if they have like three genders, things like that, their aesthetics are going to be really incomprehensible to us, would be my
Ring
guess.
species. Wow, they're crazy.
Oh yeah, exactly. Ring. If their planet is a ring species, yeah, it's going to be so different. That said, if they did evolve all the way to kind of like computationally complete, logical linguistic like forms of cognition, and they have access to kind of the 5-MeO DMT space, those two things together might be enough of a nexus that at least we can like agree to disagree, or like understand why we are so repulsed by each other's aesthetics, and that might be the minimal condition, I suspect.
Fascinating.
So yeah, to reiterate, like computationally complete logical linguistic cognition and access to pure consciousness might be the necessary nexus. I'm speculating, obviously, but yeah.
Yeah, I guess we'll know more as things will come into focus. The more we have, I guess, ways to test and objectively test these sorts of things. That's true. But yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it? Any other questions, anybody? Yeah, I'll chat with a few on I guess on Facebook about stuff relating to the up and coming conference then. Yeah.
Awesome.
Cool.
Take care,
Thanks
everybody
for coming and joining in. I really appreciate it.